I'm Haley Mills, the podcast producer for Integration Nation. In this conversation, Alison talks with Dr. Leslie Korn about our relationship with nutrition and its impact on our mental, physical, and emotional health. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this episode, and I will touch base with everybody afterwards to sum up what Alison talked about and to give you a heads up on what to look forward to in the coming episodes as we expand on the idea of identity.
Hi, I'm Alison Sullivan, a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and you are listening to Integration Nation, a podcast to introduce you to and expand your knowledge about effective, integrative mental health concepts, practices, and approaches. So today's guest, I met about a year and a half ago in Arizona when I was taking my certification course to become a mental health integrative medicine provider. And I was immediately struck by the combination of expertise and real heart-centered connection to the work that today's guest really displayed. It was a week-long certification course that taught me more useful information and validated so much about my prior thinking about our healing journeys and integrative mental health than I think any other certification class I've ever taken has. So today's guest is Dr. Leslie Korn, and she's here to talk with us in continuing our conversation this season about identity across time. She's here to talk to us about our relationship with nutrition. Dr. Korn lives and works in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and consults and teaches internationally via distance communication. She's a renowned integrative medicine clinician and educator specializing in the use of nutritional, herbal, and culinary medicine for the treatment of trauma and emotional and chronic physical illness. She's known for her dynamism and humor as a speaker. She's provided over 60,000 hours of treatment in private practice for diverse populations. Her clinical practice focuses on providing clients effective alternatives to psychotropics. Dr. Korn completed her graduate education in the departments of psychiatry and public health at Harvard Medical School and her life training in the jungle of Mexico, where she lived and worked alongside local healers for over 25 years. She directed a naturopathic medicine and training clinic facilitating health, culinary, and fitness retreats. She's licensed and certified in nutritional therapy, mental health counseling, and bodywork, and is an approved clinical supervisor. Dr. Korn introduced somatic therapies for complex trauma patients in outpatient psychiatry at Harvard Medical School in 1985 and served as a consultant in ethnomedicine to the Trauma Clinic in Boston. She is the former clinical director and faculty of the New England School of Acupuncture and the National College of Naturopathic Medicine. She is the author of this seminal book on the body and complex trauma, Rhythms of Recovery, Trauma, Nature and the Body, the textbook Nutrition Essentials for Mental Health, Eat Right, Feel Right, and The Good Mood Kitchen. Her new book, which I'm super excited about, by the way, is Herbal Medicine for Women, and that will be out in 2019. She was a founder of the National Certification Board for Therapeutic Massage and Bodywork, a Fulbright Research Scholar in Herbal Medicine, and an NIH-funded scientist in mind-body medicine. She is in private practice doing supervision and career counseling for mental health clinicians, and is the research director at the Center for World Indigenous Studies, where she designs culinary and herbal medicine programs with tribal communities engaged in developing integrative medicine programs. So from that incredible bio, you can see why I am just so honored that Dr. Korn has taken time out of her schedule to have this meaningful conversation with us. Those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast understand how we view nutrition and nutritional therapy as a foundation element of integrative mental health. And Dr. Korn's wealth of both lived and educated experience in this field is going to offer us so much richness in this conversation. So I am so excited to welcome Dr. Leslie Korn. I'd like to take a minute to thank one of our sponsors, Dragonfly Yoga Studio of Fredericksburg, located at 810 Caroline Street or at dragonflyyogafred.com. Dragonfly Yoga Studio really is a comprehensive, inclusive yoga community. And I want to highlight one of their new classes for our listeners, their Intro to Yoga class. This is different than just a beginner class because it really is a class that will give you all of the introductory information about yoga, yoga poses, philosophy. It's perfect if you have been thinking about starting a yoga practice and maybe are a little concerned about starting off at a beginner class. This Intro to Yoga class is for you. And it's another reason that Dragonfly Yoga Studio of Fredericksburg really knows how to meet the community where the community is, offering a wide range of classes with huge variability in time and accessibility. Go to their website. You will see exactly what I am talking about. It's a beautiful studio with skilled instructors and yoga to meet you wherever you are. Well, welcome, Dr. Korn, to Integration Nation. I have been really eager to have this conversation with you for so many reasons, probably mostly because of your vast experience in the field of nutrition, you as a healer in so many modalities. I just think that our listeners can really benefit from the depth of your knowledge in this field. So welcome to our podcast today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, great. So we were talking a little bit before I started recording about, what the focus of season 3 is. And we're really kind of talking about our identity across time and understanding our relationship with nutrition throughout our lifespan is a really important aspect of that. And, just in a very brief way, I was raised in the 80s, and the relationship that I developed with nutrition was really heavily influenced by convenience foods. Lots of soda, lots of boxed foods, boxed potatoes, chips, all that kind of stuff. The quicker, the better. We did have a small garden, so that supplemented our food, but I was really, a part of that 80s trend of fast food and convenience. And the impact of that over time on my health became really significant, resulting in a health crisis in my late 30s and early 40s with some significant food allergies, some debilitating illnesses, and it required me to really do a nutrition overhaul. And it was when I did that nutrition overhaul and really started my education about that I really understood that was the missing piece in an integrative approach to healing, because what happened for me, both physically and mentally, was a tremendous shift. And so, in your work, I know you see this all the time. And one of the things that you refer to in your work that I love is this notion of nutritional trauma. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about that, what you mean by that, and how that can show up in people's lives?
Sure. Let me tell you, having been raised in the 50s, I was at the start of that process because, speaking of process, it's the processed foods that really came into existence post-World War II. And so I think you got to experience it, and we're still seeing it. I think we're seeing two major streams. One is the return to natural foods and what nature's given us, but I think we're still battling this real nutrition trauma. And I developed this idea of nutrition trauma having been very fortunate to travel to the jungle of Mexico when I was in my early 20s. And I always like to joke about it because it was the best thing that ever happened to me, getting sick with absolutely everything there was to get sick with in the jungle. But the benefits of that is I met very early on all of these wonderful women healers and curanderas and herbalists where there was no doctor, there were no roads, there was no electricity. And so people were still living very much in a nature environment in which we look to foods and herbs for healing. And that was where I was thrust into this whole concept of healing and self-healing using nature, using foods and medicines. And over time, my first decade there, I evolved as I was learning with women, but also brought my own knowledge, having come from suburban Boston, having grown up and eaten many of the types of foods that you described also. This was the revolution in canned foods and packaged foods.
Right.
And I don't think I'd had any beans until I was 20. And embarked on a vegetarian diet with a little bit of fish, mainly because that's what was available in the jungle. And I learned really how to get myself healthy and keep myself healthy just by virtue of living where there were no processed foods. However, what happened is over the course of 10 years, my work evolved in the village. I opened up a little health center. And what I noticed is we were moving away from these kinds of infectious diseases that happens in rural areas and still exists throughout much of the world, where there is not the development for good hygiene, running water, boiling water, that kind of thing. There was a very rapid shift into chronic illness that accompanied the introduction of all of these processed foods into this small indigenous community. And this was happening all over Mexico, but also continues to happen all over the world. And so I saw almost overnight this transition from these infectious diseases into diabetes and heart disease and cancer. You know, I say overnight, it was a 10, 15-year period. And I began to see this as nutrition trauma, the introduction of foods for which, in this case, indigenous bodies were not suited, is a trauma. It's an emotional trauma and it's a physical trauma. And because I also worked and began my work with an American Indian organization, we were looking at this happening all throughout the Pacific Northwest, all throughout the United States, all throughout the Arctic, and really expanded this concept throughout the world where you could track the introduction of foods that are not suited to people's bodies and minds and watch the deterioration of those bodies and minds as a result. So that was where this concept of nutrition trauma began.
I think that's such an important distinction that you just described for us about infectious disease as opposed to chronic illness, because I think sometimes people kind of just lump illness into one bucket and don't look any deeper. And what you just described really highlights that there is a difference between infectious disease and chronic illness. And oftentimes the difference is, what are we eating and how are we living and how is that contributing or endangering our health?
Absolutely, because especially when we're thinking about how we're going to heal ourselves, certainly how we're going to prevent chronic illness and mental illness is generally a chronic illness. When we think about depression, depression does not occur overnight. It's a chronic illness that generally begins with chronic stress. and chronic trauma, and
Yes.
then slowly builds. As same thing with anxiety. It's certainly true. We can have these events in life that catapult us, like an anxious experience or an overwhelming acute experience, or something that's bothering us that triggers insomnia. But most of what we see are these chronic affective states that are linked to chronic physical states. And I think part of our recovery is not only knowing how nutrition and lifestyle can prevent and treat that, but realizing that the physical and the mental really do go together.
That makes a lot of sense. And we talk about that quite a bit in each topic that we unpack in this podcast. And, we talked earlier episodes this season about this concept of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and how childhood trauma, we now know can have lifelong health impacts. And nutrition is a key piece of that. However, you also just highlighted another aspect that I think applies to all of us, this notion of stress and the amount of stress in our life and how we are experiencing stress, how we're managing stress physiologically, emotionally, mentally, because that over time can be really detrimental.
Absolutely. Indeed, I think that's our major link to the ACEs. The experience of a one-time stressor in childhood, let's say, that gets addressed, is very different on the body and mind than the relentless exposure to an ACE, which has a multitude of effects on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We know, for example, that digestion of food must occur in a parasympathetic state, in a state of relaxation. So what happens to the child who is in a chronic state of hypervigilance because of living around an exposure that they never know what's going to happen? So that just beginning there, that state of hypervigilance is going to alter the capacity to digest food, absorb the nutrients, utilize the fats for the brain, which after all is 60% fat. And that is just the start of the cascading effects that lead to poor digestion, poor health that can last a lifetime unless it's proactively reversed.
Absolutely. And I know in my own experience, there were several ACEs in my childhood. And, one of the ways that I used to try and cope was I would escape the meal table as quickly as I could. And so, meals were not something that were relaxed, and meals were not something that were typically enjoyed. And so the combination of, the processed food and that heightened stress response impacted my ability to digest in the ways that you just so clearly outlined. And I think that kind of awareness, developing that awareness in each of our lived experiences is a really important first step in understanding how to care for our bodies and our relationship with nutrition today.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of the areas in my intake that I do with all of my clients and that I encourage people, particularly in mental health, to do, because we're not generally trained to do this. We're not often informed about it. Indeed, we're ourselves overcoming the dissociation that there's a separation where people should be treated just mentally and not physically. And so one of the whole areas of this intake that I do is ask the question, what were meal times like when you grew up? What was your response to food? What were your favorite foods? Because people often aren't aware that they continue to carry on their nutritional patterns and their eating patterns into adulthood without knowing that it's being informed and driven by those early life experiences.
Exactly. And one of the ways that I see that in my practice a lot is using food to numb, to self-medicate. And people's awareness of that really does begin to shift when we start to have those types of conversations about, tell me what your nighttime routines are. Tell me what you typically do when you come home from work. And a starting point like that allows people, in a less threatening way, to start to understand numbing through food as maybe an attempt to cope with stress.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I would like to talk about, help us understand this notion of bioindividuality, because that's another key piece, I think, to understanding our relationship, our identity with food across time. And, one way that I see this kind of in my practice is this notion of this latest approach to eating, this latest way of utilizing food is kind of a one size fits all approach, a magic wand. If I adopt this way of eating, if I restrict this, if I eliminate this, then that's going to fix everything. And what I've come to learn that's really a translation for, I'm not enough in some way. I'm not enough, and I need to use this diet to somehow make me enough, either by losing weight or by changing my size or whatever it is. And I think that's a setup for entrenching disassociation from identity. And it doesn't help us support our physiology in a way that is meaningful and health restorative.
I'm so glad you're making these connections, because I think where we begin is in that self-awareness and raising our awareness and making all of these connections around our behaviors and our nourishment. In mental health, our work is so much about emotional nourishment. What we do here is bring in, how am I nourishing myself with what I'm putting into my body? And then observing, how do I respond to what I'm putting into my body? Because that's where often the numbing occurs.
Yes.
And then what we say is, oh, I've got this pain. Oh, I have a stomach ache. Oh, I have acid reflux. I don't know why, but I'm going to suppress those symptoms.
Right.
Rather than asking and exploring what's causing these symptoms. And that's, I think, where we begin. And then the next step is to say, I'm an individual and I'm going to resist the yearly trends that are pushing whatever the food is or whatever the model of food is, whether it's fasting or losing weight or building muscle or doing paleo or keto or veganism. It's that we have to remember is really coming from the same place as pushing canned green beans or Pop-Tarts. It's trying to sell us something. And so what we're doing is we're taking back our own power for our own identity and saying, who am I and what nourishes me truly?
Gosh, that's such a powerful way to connect people, with their personal power, the way you just described that. Yes, when people reach for that, it actually ends up to be disempowering instead of exploring a way back to themselves.
Yes. And the application of that is in the concept called bioindividuality. And what that refers to is that we are all individuals, and we may say that, but the next step is to recognize that individually, the metaphor that I use is we're all driving different cars. Now, some cars take 87 octane, like a VW. A VW is a car that can drive on anything. And some of us have those bodies. That's called a mixed oxidizer. That's someone that can eat vegetarian, carnivore, in between. That car is the VW of people. It can run on anything. Then there are cars that are very fussy. There are cars that need a very specific mix of food. That's your 90 octane. It's very refined, or your diesel, or you start messing around with that, you're really in trouble. You might sputter for a while and do okay, but over time, you're not going to do well. And then, of course, there's the other end of the spectrum, the vegetarian cars. They're going to do well on vegetables. Now, the way this translates to our identity is so multifaceted. And this is where my work working with indigenous communities really informed this, is that the Inuit people, let's consider the people who evolved genetically and environmentally in cold climates with the foods that nature gave them. Nature gave them foods that were rich in fats to keep the body insulated and very low carbohydrates. These people are called fast oxidizers. They do well on the keto diet. They do well on lots of fats and moderate protein and very low carbs. I mean, you get some berries appearing in the summer for a few weeks, but that's it. But you put someone in that area, that culture, that identity on a vegetarian diet, they're going to keel over and die. Because those diets evolved in the warmer climates, the tropical climates that are rich in the carbohydrates. And then, of course, the majority of people are generally what we call mixed. They do well on combinations of all foods, depending on those ratios. And this, to me, puts to rest this idea that there's any one right diet to follow. There isn't. We have to understand who we are, where we're from. And most of us living in the United States, most of us come from another area of the world, whether it's Europe, Asia, Africa, Polynesia, whatever place we come from, we still carry the genetics of our ancestors. And that is going to inform best our dietary choices.
That's such a great way to explain a complicated idea. I love the notion of car engines, and I have borrowed that since training with you in kind of helping my own clients begin to understand this concept. The other thing I wanted to kind of follow up on that you just described is this notion of ancestral genetic carryover, because I think sometimes there's a mindset that, okay, we are living here now, and so where our ancestors lived and how they needed to eat doesn't really impact who we are now. And I, based on your work and this conversation we're having, I'm not certain that that's really useful for people. I think and in the spirit of integration, I think it's more of a both and understanding where you came from and how the people in your history ate and how you can bring that into your modern existence in a way that is nourishing based on what you're discovering about your body through self-awareness.
Yes, indeed. And it's not that it needs to be that we need to eat like our ancestors did 400 or 500 years ago. It's really the concept of the principles of how they ate. There are going to be the same types of foods everywhere in the world. For example, there are saturated fats everywhere in the world. And we go through so many myths and so many scares, like the myth of saturated fat being bad for you. But if you look at our ancestors who've always eaten plenty of saturated fats, let's go back to the Inuit example. The Inuits, most of their diet is saturated fat. And prior to the arrival of these introduction of nutrition trauma, the wheats and the refined foods and the sugar and the soy proteins, people did not have heart disease. They did not have cancer. So there are many ways in which our ancestral knowledge shares with us. We can, regardless of what double-blind placebo studies tell us, and we can talk about why those fail oftentimes, we can understand the health of our ancestors and bring those behaviors and those food choices into our own health and well-being.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I think that might be less overwhelming for our listeners to understand that it really is about the principle. And maybe it's really, I used to hear that if we ate more along the lines of our grandparents, we would be more in striking distance of nourishing our body. I'm wondering now if maybe that's not actually our great-grandparents.
I think so. I think we have to go back a little further these days. But it is the basic principle. For example, if you travel the world, you will not see any ancestral refined foods. You will not see those processed foods. And if that is the first place to begin, you don't see refined and heated oils. This is the fuel for our brain. So the general principles were rooted in what nature provides us. From there, you can refine it a little bit more closely. I work with a lot of people of Irish descent, for example. Of course, I love Ireland. It's an amazing country at so many levels, especially related to identity and reclaiming identity.
Yes.
And that's happening in food. So what are the traditional foods of Ireland? The traditional foods are salmon and seaweed. Now, of course, they've perfected the art of Guinness as medicine as well. Again, the hops and the B vitamins. And so if we look to our ancestry, what did our Irish ancestors eat? They ate from the sea because they are surrounded by the sea. And that provided the good fats and the minerals from seafoods. And so anyone, even if their ancestors came 100, 150 years ago over to the United States, they still carry Irish bodies that are going to thrive on salmon and seaweed.
Well, as one of those Irish bodies, I can attest to that. And over the years, as I have implemented all of this knowledge in my own healing journey, that's where I've settled. I've settled on a diet that is mostly fish-based, that is gluten-free, that is dairy-free, and just is carbs that are more related to vegetables. So a very low-grain, fish-centric, with some vegetable around the side diet. And that has really improved my health mentally, physically, comprehensively. I feel more energized. I feel more alert. I just actually feel like I have a more balanced relationship with food. And so, you also brought up another aspect that I want to talk about a little bit more when you were talking about processed food. And with processed food comes sugar. And you describe in one of your books, you say sugar is a food of trauma. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that because I 100% agree. And I'm not sure I have heard any other nutrition expert really describe it that way. And I think that actually encapsulates sugar, processed sugar.
Mm-hmm. I wrote about that when I was writing about the history of the sugar trade and the history of slavery.
Right.
And all of my work, I feel it's so important that we're working on our own health, but we're also addressing social justice issues. And food is an important link between our personal health and social justice.
Yes, it is. And a vital part of our identity. And if we don't understand where we are in that spectrum of privilege and or oppression and the social justice component that's woven throughout all of that, it's going to impact our ability to really be self-aware and consciously making choices.
Yes, and it's going to affect our ability to help others. Sugar, for example, used to be the food of rich people. Indeed, at one point it was promoted as medicine, just like cigarettes at one point promoted as medicine, as improving your health. And what you used to see was it was only rich people. We're going back to the late 1800s, for example, who had these diseases of sugar. But then it switched, and when it became mass produced, it's now, as we see, it's the food of poor people. It's the food of it because it's so put into all of these low quality foods that are inexpensively produced, and it becomes part of these food deserts that are available in in communities who don't have access to other quality foods. And so I think there are a couple of levels of nutrition trauma and sugar trauma. One is that sugar has been, and in some instances continues to be, produced based on the backs of people who were enslaved.
Yes.
This remains a major social trauma that remains unresolved in the United States.
Agree.
We'll focus on the United States, and it remains a major problem that has so many intersections with individual health, with areas of hypertension and hypervigilance, and what it means to be a survivor and an ancestral survivor of people who were enslaved. So I think there's a whole level there around identity. At the same time, as you well point out, the self-medication that goes on as a result of trauma is often done with sugar. I've never had anyone say, "Oh, I'm addicted to celery." We are not self-medicating with celery and carrots. We're self-medicating with sugar. So it does become a drug that we become addicted to that alters our consciousness, alters our brain function, but also is the major contributing factor to the intersection of food, sugar, and the ACEs as a causative factor in depression.
Absolutely. So let's talk about functional hypoglycemia as a specific aspect of this, because that has a physical cost and that has a mental and an emotional cost that I'm not sure are really understood by people.
Mm-hmm. It's a very common undiagnosed problem in both children and adults that leads to a variety of symptoms that can be misdiagnosed as mental health problems. So functional hypoglycemia, very simply put, is where blood sugar rises in response to food intake, and then it drops. Now, normally we eat, our blood sugar rises, our brain needs glucose, we have energy, we proceed along our day, and it rises and falls in very gentle slopes. And I have a saying where mood follows food. As your blood sugar rises, your mood rises. As your blood sugar drops, your mood drops. And we've all had this experience where if we go too long without eating, we're ready for lunch, we're maybe in a meeting too long, we're with a client, and it's like, oh, I'm looking at my watch, I'm starting to feel a little irritable, I'm feeling maybe a little anxious and fidgety, I may even start to feel a little sweaty, and that's where your blood sugar is dropping, your brain is losing its glucose, and I need to get more glucose. Now, where this becomes important related to ACEs and trauma is that the chronic stress we're exposed to under the ACE influence makes our ability to hold on to our blood glucose that much more difficult. It's kind of like having a pail with holes in it, and you keep filling it up with water, your food, and you want to nourish yourself, but you've got so many holes in the pail, the food is just falling through and you can't hold on to it.
What a great analogy.
Well, the result is that your mood fluctuates, your energy fluctuates, and this leads to a whole set of symptoms that get misdiagnosed as ADHD. You become irritable, you get angry, you can't manage your anger. And we miss this in the clinical setting. And then we want to treat it with medication and drugs. Oh, you're mood labile. Oh, you're bipolar. When in fact, to a large degree, many, many people suffer from functional hypoglycemia that goes on throughout the day. And in the evening, it leads to middle of the night insomnia where you wake up and you can't get back to sleep because your blood glucose has dropped. This is a very common scenario in people who've experienced chronic stress and the ACEs.
That's revolutionary, really. When you really sit back and think about that notion of really understanding the impact of functional hypoglycemia can really revolutionize how we are as mental health professionals, of course, but also just as people, how we are conceptualizing and taking note of whatever we're experiencing. I think, as you correctly stated, most mental health professionals, most clinicians are looking at it from, okay, you're checking these boxes of these symptoms. This means you fit in this diagnostic criteria. If we just explore a little differently and open up to these concepts, maybe we can begin to help empower people to look at not only what they're experiencing energy and mood wise in relationship to what they're eating, but how to actually use food then and use new habits of food to restore more of those kind of rolling hills or rolling waves that you described, and actually improve our health, not just squelch symptoms or create a cascade of more difficult symptoms to get underneath down the road.
Yes, indeed. The diet that you described, Alison, for you, that works for you, is a perfect anti-hypoglycemia diet. It's rich in protein, it's rich in complex carbs, and it's low in grains. Now, grains, some people do okay with grains, but I did want to mention, and particularly dairy, as you point out, most people don't do well with dairy, particularly cow's dairy. And so that's one of the first things I suggest people eliminate. But what you've described is an anti-hypoglycemic diet where you look to protein that usually has fat,
Yes.
fish, or even beans. You might make beans and add maybe a little bit of olive oil to them, or you've got your salads with protein. Anytime you pair your protein and your complex carbs along with a little fat, that is your anti-hypoglycemic diet. And what I say to my patients when they're coming in and they're talking about being mood labile, or maybe they're on meds and they want to get off their meds, I say, we don't know what your mood is until we fix your diet, until we give you the fuel for your engine that your engine needs to run smoothly. Because right now you're pumping so much sugar and excitotoxins, these preservatives and food colorings that excite the brain and make you moody. We don't know who you really are until we stabilize you with protein and good quality carbs.
What an empowering way to kind of interrupt that narrative that so many people come in with of, oh, I'm bipolar, oh, I'm this, oh, I'm that. Just interrupting the narrative with the notion of, actually, we don't know who you are because we have to detox you. We have to remove these toxic patterns and introduce nourishing patterns to actually see what your mood cycling, what your mood tendencies are, because we do not know that. And I think that that's what most people, at least most people that come into my practice and most people really that I come in contact with, do intuitively as they reach for a simple carb. They reach for the muffin, they reach for the candy bar, they reach for the cereal. The simple carb is a way to kind of boost mood and boost energy. What it does is it just kind of reinforces that kind of rocketing up and that crashing down.
Yes, that is what I call, in terms of self-care and in terms of treatment as clinicians, the principle of substitutions. Understanding why we grab a certain food, that it's for a specific biochemical and emotional reason. And if we understand why we're doing that, if we then grab something consciously to create a conscious response, not the unconscious response. And so understanding that, let's say, grabbing that muffin will increase energy in the short term, but an hour later cause you to crash, and then it cause perhaps a gut permeability, which leads to long-term depression issues. Then you can say, okay, why am I grabbing this muffin at 10 a.m.? Would it help me if I had 2 hard-boiled eggs at 9 a.m.? Because I'm not going to crave sugar an hour later. It's going to stabilize me. And then you can get maybe a gluten-free nut muffin, which is rich again in protein and fat, so that understanding that we can bring consciousness to altering our consciousness, but we're in control. It's not the unconscious that's driving it.
And that's really what I'm hoping that listeners glean from this conversation is that that's the good news, really taking the time to explore your history with nutrition and food and explore your unique experiences across time is going to help you start to understand how you're unconsciously reacting with food and allow you to start to make conscious decisions regarding food, which will actually improve your health, your mood, your relationships, all of it. It actually will work. And it's at its core a really empowering framework to utilize.
Yes, as a matter of fact, one of the things that I share with my students who are in mental health is that if their clients integrate a nutritional approach into their work, they will get the other missing piece, the 50%. That's the other piece that isn't being addressed by missing the nutrition. And likewise, people who are focusing just on nutrition, who aren't doing the mental health work, the therapeutic, the counseling, they will get that. So putting them together, what is called mental health nutrition, really, in my clinical experience, is what gives you the best, most comprehensive response to well-being at the physical, emotional, mental, and even spiritual level.
I couldn't agree more. And that's my experience professionally and personally. And when I went to your training in Arizona and heard what you were sharing, I just kept having one yes moment after another. Yes, 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 because it truly is an integrative approach. It truly is both and. It truly is understanding the mind body as one system, not separate systems that we treat in an either or fashion. So along those lines, before we run out of time, I want to talk a little bit more about digestion and fat. I want to talk about digestion because, for obvious reasons, as we talked about a little bit earlier, it really is what we need to get a handle on to be able to improve, because if we are not digesting food, we cannot absorb the nutrients and we cannot utilize, even if we're eating nourishing food, we are not going to benefit from it if we're not supporting our digestion.
Yes, so digestion begins really in the mouth. It begins with our smelling of food. If you think about, just close your eyes right now and think about a lemon. If you do that for a moment, you will start to salivate because your brain is involved in that digestive process. So I begin with people to understand that one needs to be relaxed for all the digestive juices to flow. And to chew food in the mouth, to salivate it and take time. That's where mindfulness comes in. We break down the food in the mouth before it even goes down our gullet, down into our stomach, where it's then churning around with lots of acids, for example. And so taking the moment to consider that we're taking nourishment in, we are breaking it down and making it available to ourselves is a first step. Now, there's no question that because of people's experience of ACEs, because of chronic illness, I have a saying that diet is essential, but it's not sufficient. Most people with poor digestion, and I guarantee you that anyone with a mental health form of distress, mental distress of any form, has some digestive problems somewhere along the route of digestion. And so this is where some supplementation is required. One of the first ways to assist your digestion is just adding in some digestive enzymes. They're inexpensive, and think about just adding a little bit more fire to your pot while you're heating it. You're going to cause it to interact. You're going to cause it to boil. You're heating it up and you're allowing it to break down so you can actually use it as it goes through your small intestine and then eliminated through the large intestine. So that simply is one first step people can make. If they find that they're burping a lot, or they've got a lot of gas, or they've got stomach pain after they eat. Those are all signs that they'll benefit from some digestive enzymes.
Such an important point. And I think, you so eloquently describe that in a way that helps people kind of meet themselves where they are. This isn't something that is kind of an event. It's a process over time of understanding, how can I support my digestion? How can I maybe eat in an atmosphere that's a little more relaxing, that feels a little less stressful? How can I connect with my food a little more consciously? And how can I physiologically support my body in absorbing that nutrition? When we did our first food and mood group here, that was a really big part of the group over time, was first of all explaining to people what probiotics were, what prebiotics are, how to combine them, how to pair foods so that they have probiotic value and prebiotic value, and how to utilize that with mindful routines to create an environment where their digestion could be supported.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you raised probiotics, because that's a wonderful link to identity. If we look at people all throughout the world, every culture has a probiotic. Every culture has a prebiotic. And I always encourage my clients to explore their own heritage's a probiotic. Is it kimchi? Is it sauerkraut? Is it yogurt? Is it kefir? It kind of making those links to recognize that our ancestors always have made their fresh probiotics daily as an essential aspect of health.
Absolutely. And I think, the ritual component of that, of really connecting with yourself in a daily way, but also connecting with where you came from historically and across time, is a beautiful way to consciously care for not only the selves that you have been, but also the selves that you are not yet, that you are becoming. It's a way to heal what was before and to create a more empowered, healed future, not only for yourself, but who comes after you. All right. So one final area, let's talk a little bit about fat. You mentioned a really important statistic early in our conversation, that our brains are 60% fat. And that may be a surprising statistic to hear for some people.
Yes, well, we need fat, and we are coming through this period where fat has been unjustly maligned. But we know through science and through empirical knowledge by looking at our ancestors that fat is not only essential for brain function. We know, for example, speaking of the life cycle, that children who do not get enough fat during the first year of their life often have learning disorders by the age of 10. And so the long-term effects of too low fat a diet will show up in learning disorders. And indeed, it makes sense that one of the best interventions for learning disorders and developmental concerns is good quality fat. Indeed, we supplement cholesterol powder in many children on the autism spectrum because of the need for more cholesterol in the body and in the brain. And so people should not be afraid of good fats. And I suggest it's one of the best first steps that people can make to improve their health, because a good quality fat is medicine and a poor quality fat is actually poison. So it's a very clear-cut decision. And I've never had anyone complain to me when I suggested that they eat more butter, their canola oil. So this is the other thing, that we want to make some of these changes simple, well accepted, and as we make these positive changes, some of the bad habits that we have can fall away much more easily.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, every time I put a little bit of ghee in my cast iron skillet to saute up some garlic and some onions before I add it to a recipe, I get excited, because I know that not only is that going to taste good, but that is good, healthy fat for my brain and my body.
Well, Allison, I think our next show has to be a cooking show because now I'm getting hungry. Here's another little kind of fact for people listening, that the combination of fat with a green, particularly our bitter green.
Oh, love those bitter greens, especially arugula.
Oh, yes. It's such a perfect combination because our fat needs to be broken down in order to use it. And the best food to break it down are these dark leafy greens. So when you're steaming your dark leafy greens, you can feel that you're giving yourself medicine when you put a little ghee or a little butter, a little olive oil on top of it. The combination is a perfect combination for a healthy liver, a healthy gallbladder, and a healthy brain.
Oh my goodness. Dr. Korn, thank you so much for spending your time with us today and unpacking so many important concepts about our relationship with nutrition, how that relates to our identity, and I think most importantly, how we actually have more power than we realize to unlearn and relearn, to actually restory what our relationship with food is by coming online in a more conscious, self-aware way. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, wow. Such a wealth of information. Thank you so much, Dr. Korn. And I just, want to let our listeners know that we on our website have links to how to find Dr. Korn. We talk about on a regular basis how this podcast is for educational purposes and not a substitute for professional healthcare treatment. And, in support of that, I encourage you to really use those links to find Dr. Korn because she is a healthcare professional that you're going to want to get to know either on a one-on-one basis or follow her work. Read her books. She embodies the essence of health and healing, as I'm sure you could feel in our conversation, ranging from nutritional trauma to social justice issues around food, how we can start to heal our own relationships with food. I could talk to her over and over again about any and all of these topics. And in support of that, wherever you are in your relationship with nutrition, I want to mention our other sponsor of the podcast, skintouchtherapyspa.com, located in the heart of downtown Fredericksburg at 714 Caroline Street, because they have infrared saunas, and they have a deal going on right now where you can access their infrared saunas for $15 during their happy hour from 3 to 5 Monday through Friday. And that's really important because infrared saunas really facilitate and support our bodies in detoxing. And detoxing is a really important part of holistic wellness and part of healing our relationship with nutrition. So check out that deal. You can go to their website. You can see how beautiful the saunas are. You can talk to someone there. They can walk you through it. It's really accessible. It's really affordable. And it's a really important way to support your body in healing from nutritional trauma. So in the spirit of that, if you've been a regular listener, this season we are focusing on all of these topics as part of a person's identity across time. And so it may be weird to think of your relationship with nutrition as part of your identity. However, it's a really important aspect of identity. And it does change over time. It evolves, it shifts, it opens up, it transitions. And so today's letter that I'm going to read is a letter I wrote to myself from my body, to my body, from my mind, about that relationship with food. And so I invite you all to consider this letter writing technique that we are illustrating throughout this season as a way to kind of gain some insight about where you are in your relationship with food and how your mind and body are communicating with each other, because all of that is really important along your journey in healing with food. To my body, from my mind, about our relationship with food. I don't have to tell you, it's been complicated. And you, dear body, have often paid a steep price for my choices, my habits, and my ignorance. And I think that's an important place to start. Acknowledging what I didn't know then and what I absolutely know now. I didn't understand that I was traumatizing you. Actually, at times starving you of the nutrients you needed from healthy, unprocessed food. I was so disconnected from you in that way, actually neglectful, and I just expected you to deal with it and leave me alone. I see now how you tried to get my attention, the stomach pain, the illnesses, the depression, the PMS. I wasn't ready to be accountable for my choices, and I also still saw us as separate. I thought it was literally mind over body, although I'm now really embarrassed to admit that. My ignorance cost you so much in health, in function, in peace, and I'm sorry. I understand now that we are an intimate partnership, part of the same complex, beautiful system, and that we are actually in constant communication. Over the past 10 years, I've tried to make amends to you by listening, by learning about what you need, and by consistently finding better ways to nurture our relationship with each other first, and through our relationship with food. I commit to you to continue to put effort into our partnership, to continue to adapt and change based on what we need, and to also learn from the mistakes and missteps that I will inevitably make. And I commit to continue working to empower others to do the same, because we heal as we help others to heal. Thank you for your persistence. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for always trying to show up for me even when I ignored you. Your unconditional love and support is my foundation. With deep gratitude and respect, Alison.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Integration Nation with Alison Sullivan, licensed clinical social worker located in downtown Fredericksburg, Virginia. We are going to continue to explore and discuss with our guests throughout the season how to integrate our experiences, the roles that we take on, and the unique aspects of ourselves in developing and making sense of our identity across time. Our upcoming episodes will be featuring international and local experts on breathwork, bodywork, parenting, and other important aspects of our identity. Listen to more episodes surrounding these concepts and integrative mental health at alisonsintegrativehealth.org.